different aspects of formation, to intellectual formation, to an experience of an example of curriculum or course on eco-theology. And then the course of eco-theology has different aspects. And one of the things that we have to understand in eco-theology is, of course, the scientific and historical background. So we had three speakers yesterday: Bishop Alwin de Silva, Father Luke Rodriguez, and Dean Antonio Lavinia. Now, in the Ratio Fundamentalis, we have three images of the church that actually come from Pope Francis. A church that goes forth, a mother with an open heart, and a church that is like a battlefield hospital. That's why we need priests who are missionary disciples in love with the Master, shepherds with the smell of the sheep, who live in the midst of the sheep to serve them and to bring the mercy of God to them, and priests who are disciples on a journey, constantly in need of integral formation. That is the image of priests in the Ratio Fundamentalis. Now, how do we form those priests? According to the Ratio, formation of presbyters is one, integral, communitarian, and missionary. It's as if you're talking of the church: one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Yeah. One, because formation is one arc that begins in the family and is continued in the seminary and continues even as priest. Permanent formation. That is one arc of formation. Integral because there are four elements of formation. No? Human, spiritual, intellectual, and pastoral. Communitarian because the seminarian comes from the context of a community, Christian community. He is formed in the context of a Christian community in the seminary, and then he will be sent to be at the service of a Christian community, particularly the diocese, parish, etc. And of course, missionary. The formation in the seminary will not keep the seminarian in the seminary. He will not be ordained for the seminary. He will be sent on mission. And that mission is not simply parochial. It has also a universal component. Now, integral, human, spiritual, intellectual, pastoral. Now, for Bishop Alwin, there are three key words: humanity, spirituality, and discernment. And then, focusing on the climate change, where climate change is mentioned in the Ratio Fundamentalis, it is couched in the context of formation in the social doctrine of the church. And a component of social doctrine of the church is this: the ecological question, caring for our common home, and ecological conversion. Incidentally, that is one of the important themes of the Amazon Synod. From listening to the Amazon to integral conversion. And that integral conversion has four elements: pastoral conversion, cultural conversion, ecological conversion, and synodal conversion. Now, Father Luke gave us an excellent overview of the course on eco-theology. The objectives, of course, they are short-term and long-term. In a way, you can say it's KSA: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Of course, integrated into a whole spirituality, an ecological spirituality. Like that. Excellent. And of course, the three phases of eco-theology: conversion, communion, commitment, translated into repentance, relationship, and renewal. Wonderful. Now, as part of the knowledge, that component, so you see from the university in particular, as part of the knowledge component, we heard Dean Antonio Lavinia speak of the science and history of climate change. There. We had a glimpse of the science, But of course, we realize that the science has much meaning only as a human issue. The cry of the earth is to be listened to as much as the cry of the poor. And incidentally, the poor includes the peoples of the earth, the original peoples, the indigenous peoples, whose fate is bound with the fate of the earth. It's also a call for intergenerational equity. Now, the science, the human dimension and meaning, and then of course, the timeline, the history of climate change. And then, Dean Antonio also gave us a glimpse of a carbon-neutral, low-carbon lifestyle. Meat-free Mondays, short Tuesdays, warm Wednesdays, seasonable Thursdays, and fuel-free Fridays. I've heard of fishy Fridays, but you know how it is, no? It doesn't matter when you abstain, as long as you contribute something to the earth there. Now, what is important also for us here, is that it is the young people who are taking up the cudgels of ecological conversion. So, and that is also important because our seminarians are their peers, and we want them to be just like them, aware and courageous. In the morning, we had the Eucharist, the welcome Eucharist with Bishop Joseph, and he gave us a wonderful gift, a clock. What does that mean? Climate emergency? Time is running out? But of course, forming seminarians into priests takes time. And hopefully, by what we do, we are sanctifying our time also. Thank you.
So thank you very much for Rico for highlighting the salient features of yesterday's, beginning with Mass and then the presentations here in auditorium. Now, we have today 3 sessions, as we know. First one now, the second at 11, and the one in the afternoon. Now, I request Father Philip Gonzalez to come and introduce our first speaker. He's very good at introducing people. Yesterday, he was. And go along. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So happy to introduce our speaker this morning, Father Clarence Devdas. He's the diocesan priest of the Archdiocese of Kuala Lumpur. He was ordained in the year 1997. He completed his postgraduate studies in moral theology from the Alphonsian Academy, Rome, in 2004. He is currently the director of the Catholic Research Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He is also the executive secretary of the Office of Theological Concerns since 2014. So I welcome Father Clarence Devdas. Let's put our hands together and welcome Father Clarence. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Whenever I'm invited to speak on issues pertaining to the environment, it's one area that I often cringe, simply because it involves some form of introspection. Looking at myself and seeing, yesterday, Dean Antonio talked about low carbon life. and 5 different days, I often ask myself how faithful I am to something like this. And when I'm speaking about the environment, am I trying my best? And I want to admit that it's sometimes very difficult. It's very difficult to be faithful to what the Holy Father is calling us to. I go back to my office. My office is air conditioned, set at 16 probably. Then you go to meetings. You travel by plane. That's another difficult area that we have. And so to be eco-friendly, it's not an easy option also. I tried once, I remember, I went to the supermarket. I said, okay, today I will get all the things that somewhat could be considered biodegradable, eco-friendly, and I came back spending 3 times more than what I would normally do. Even the detergent to wash my clothes was 3 times more than the regular detergent, that which was biodegradable. So with all these challenges, all these obstacles, one may ask, how do we communicate? How do I communicate with regard to being eco-friendly, low-carbon life, etc., to the people? And more importantly, today we're talking about seminarians and seminary formation. And so when I was asked to speak here, I asked myself, what hat do I wear when I want to speak? Am I an activist? Am I a professor? Am I a pastor? What hat do I wear to speak to such a body? I would like to approach it, as I said, many of you have more experience than I have. You are formators in the seminary. I am not. I go in to teach and I leave. And I think that's the best part. You just go in to teach and then you leave, so you don't get involved in the formation part of the seminarians. But just some reflections, and I hope that whatever I present can be a kind of a starting point for a conversation afterwards. Because some of you have great wealth of experiences of being in the seminary and forming seminarians. So that's the direction that I would like to take this morning, just to offer some thoughts that can stimulate our discussion, our conversation towards the end. So we have about an hour. I will probably speak about 30 minutes or there, and then we can have a little conversation and enrich each other in the area of seminary formation. Now, since 2015, we've all been talking about the environment, as it's not something that, just suddenly cropped up in the church, but it's been there for a while. But very importantly, in Laudato Si, number 217, it states that the protection of the common home is no longer optional. It is not something that is secondary to the Christian life. Okay? So it's not optional anymore. If you remember, I remember in my seminary training, and there was this book called Option for the Poor. Don't know how many of you saw this book by Donald Dorr. I remember that was the author. It was an option for the poor. But the Holy Father is saying that care for the environment is no longer optional. It is an integral part of who we are. But as we are talking about seminary formation, it's not something that we are talking about it just now, but it is one that evokes many different sentiments in many people. You talk to seminary professors, each one has got a different perception of how seminary formation should be. And this morning at breakfast, I was with Etienne, who's the rector in the seminary in Taiwan, and he was saying some of his ideas of how seminary formation should be. And if I talk to many of you, each one of you will have a different idea. And it is something that has been reworked since the Council of Trent in the 16th century. So over the years, not only the contents of seminary formation have evolved, but models of seminary formation have been experimented in different ways, in different eras, in different localities. However, I think there's one thing that we all can agree on, that the primary purpose of seminary formation is to produce holy priests and none other. I think that's our intention. So there are many documents. There are many documents about priestly and seminary formation. But for the purpose of this particular presentation, for the purpose of this particular presentation, I have limited myself only to 3 documents. I'm not discarding or negating the existence of all the other documents. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to look at Laudato Si, the Ratio, and Veritatis Gaudium. Just these 3 documents, so that our discussion can be a little bit more focused. Yesterday we had been reflecting on climate change, and it wasn't a random reflection on the phenomenon or the impact of climate change, but more towards its concerns for the seminary. So the objective that is right before our minds is this, that we want to see how we can integrate Laudato Si into seminary formation. Before we jump straight into what the implications of Laudato Si for seminary formation are, I would like to look more broadly at what kind of formation seminaries and other institutes of higher learning can offer in the light of the Apostolic Constitution Veritatis Gaudium. This is crucial simply because the position that I would like to take in this presentation is not merely to add another subject on the care for the common home into the curriculum. And formators have great difficulties in adjusting, deans of studies have great difficulties in adjusting the curriculum, and you add another one, the first ones to protest will be the students and not just the professors. But I would like to look at it at something concrete as Laudato Si offers that we can do almost immediately after returning home from this seminar. Veritatis Gaudium offers us 3 general guiding principles. The first being, the most urgent and enduring criterion is that of contemplation and presentation of a spiritual, intellectual, and existential introduction to the heart of the kerygma. And I think that is the key. Whatever we are going to talk about, it must have a spiritual, an intellectual, and existential introduction in the heart of the teaching. Okay? To be able to provide a fresh and attractive good news. The second guiding principle is this. Closely linked to and following from the first is the wide-ranging dialogue. Not merely a tactical approach, but an intrinsic requirement for experiencing in the community. I think this is the key, that whatever we were talking about is something that must be experienced in the community, not just a project or a plan for the future. Thirdly, the third guiding principle that I see is that whatever we are offering must be interdisciplinary and also cross-disciplinary. Whatever approaches that we are going to take. It's academic, it's formative, it's research. Everything should be able to have a conversation with another area of study or experience. So, in the light of these directions, if Laudato Si is to make inroads into seminary formation, or even seminary life as a whole, it is necessary that this be done in the spirit of contemplation, dialogue, cross-disciplinary. The care for the common home cannot be seen in isolation. It does not exist for itself, but it must be seen in relation to the other aspects of seminary formation and life. It has to become an integral part of the training of the priests. Now, this is something more recent. Subsequent to Veritatis Gaudium, in a meeting on the theme Theology after Veritatis Gaudium in the context of the Mediterranean. This was a seminar that was held, that was organized by the Pontifical Theological Faculty of Southern Italy. Pope Francis, in his opening address, he talks about 4 processes that can help. And these are the 4 processes. To talk about a theology of welcoming, a theology of listening, interdisciplinary, and network theology. So I begin to see there is a connection between Veritatis Gaudium and what Pope Francis here is saying also in terms of how can we see the implementation or the implications of Laudato Si in seminary formation. The foundational theological or ethical implication, if we are truly concerned about ecology, and many of us know, and we have already been speaking about it, is a right understanding of the concept of stewardship. And most of us are probably experts in these areas. But I would like to look at it from a wider and a broader perspective. That stewardship, as Father Luke was saying yesterday, also there is a kind of a negative understanding of stewardship. I think it was you who was saying, kind of a dominion over. So I'm looking at a broader perspective of what stewardship is all about. That the entire world is God's creation. And because it is, to continue life and to preserve life, firstly depends on God. And man, who is part of God's creation, is also dependent on Him for his survival. So we see God as the author, and we, the human race that has been created, is also dependent on God for life and for our own survival. And so with this in mind, I want to also look at Laudato Si, namely chapter 6, in the light of the discussions that we are having here. Chapter 6 is entitled Ecological Education and Spirituality. I've chosen to focus on this particular chapter. It does not mean that I'm negating or discarding or excluding the importance of all the other chapters, but for the purpose of the topic that has been given to me, seminary formation, I just want to focus on this particular chapter. The opening words of chapter 6 goes like this: many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. We lack an awareness of our common origin, of our mutual belonging, and a future to be shared with everyone. And so this basic awareness would enable the development of new convictions, new attitudes, new forms of life. A great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on a long path of renewal. And so I'm asking myself, with regard to seminary formation, what could be some new convictions? What could be some new attitudes? What could be some new forms of life that Laudato Si would encourage us to embrace? Despite the cultural, spiritual, and educational challenges that are before us, what Pope Francis is asking for us is to look at the common home as an integral ecology, which includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation. And so, new convictions, new attitudes, new forms of life now, seen in this light, it calls for a deeper reflection in the journey that we would like to take. And so, if stewardship is what we are called to, then Laudato Si calls us for a new kind of a harmony that is reflected in our lifestyles, in our ideals, which includes a contemplation of God and the realities around us. This is the hope of Pope Francis, and I think it's very clear. The focus on this integral ecology, especially for seminaries and houses of formation, lies in these words. He says, "It is my hope that our seminaries and our houses of formation will provide an education." Okay? Education is a very wide word. We're not talking about just formal education, but also informal education. In responsible simplicity of life, in grateful contemplation of God's will, in concern for the needs of the poor, and the protection of the environment. And that's what he is saying for our seminaries, for our houses of formation. And that is the intention of Laudato Si for these institutions. And so I ask myself, how then do we translate this theological principle of stewardship in the context of seminary formation? With reference to seminary formation, it would seem to me, at least the implications are fivefold. Firstly, calling for the simplicity of life. Secondly, contemplation on God, of God, concern for the poor, protection of the environment, and fifth, which I have added, looking at the ratio and also veritatis gaudium, is dialogue, or we're talking about conversations. And so these are nice concepts, and I've attached other words to what Pope Francis is asking: simplicity of life, witnessing; contemplation of God, prayer; concern for the poor as justice; protection of the environment, stewardship; dialogue as cross-cultural. So how do we bring this down into seminary formation? And this is the question that I have been asking, and hopefully afterwards in our conversation we can enrich one another. I would just like to take the 5 key points or implications that Laudato Si offers us. In this postmodern era, our lives are impacted by consumerism. No one present here in this room can say that their lives have not been impacted by consumerism. All our lives. In fact, consumerism is one of the strongest forces affecting our lives in the modern world. Everyone knows that we live in a culture of consumerism, but only a few people understand the full extent of the problems that it causes and it affects each one of us. Whether we live in urban, suburban, or rural areas, consumerism not only affects us, but more worryingly, it seems to define what the good life is. Fundamentally, consumerism promotes material goods. I found this interesting study that was done, and this was done in America, but it's just a kind of a quick look into our own lives and see how and hear how consumerism affects us. Just listen to this. In one study, it was documented that on an average, every day, each one of us, we face 1,600 commercial messages. Would you believe that? On an average. But it's very ordinary life. And the study says that a typical day for a person may be in these activities. You wake up, you open the newspapers, you are confronted with advertisements. You get in the car, you turn on the radio. After every 3 songs, there are about 5 or 6 advertisements that come on. You travel to work. You drive from Bangkok airport to the city, the number of billboards that you come across. You can't run away. You arrive at work. You turn on your computer, you turn on your email. How many advertisements you get. You go onto social media. You go onto Facebook. You go onto any other social media platforms. The number of advertisements that appear. And so, 1,600, I think, is quite a decent number, or it's a real number that we are confronted with. So, we are impacted with consumerism. I like the word Laudato Si uses. It says in number 222, less is more. And therefore, brings together the need for personal conversion and corporate responsibility. Institutions of Christian inspiration, such as seminaries, houses of formation, need to be wary of an unhealthy obsession with consumption and material prosperity. So, Laudato Si warns us about a consumeristic lifestyle. Above all, when few people are capable of maintaining it. So how do we address this in terms of our seminary formation? Laudato Si calls for a new lifestyle. Primarily, the shift has to be from a throwaway culture to a life-giving culture. I'm not just reducing this to throwaway of material things, but also in terms of relationships. Much of the relationships that we engage in today can be considered pragmatic and even utilitarian. Human relationships are sometimes being seen as usefulness and not beyond. So seminary formation needs to see how we can also promote new relationships that are life-giving within the seminary and also outside the seminary. And so, the first challenge or the first implication of Laudato Si for seminary formation is how are we going to promote a counter-consumeristic worldview? Not merely just in terms of material things, but things that would promote gospel values of humility and simplicity. I quote from the Ratio, number 111, seminarians should cultivate the spirit of poverty in practical ways. They should be formed to imitate the heart of Jesus, who became poor although he was rich, in order to enrich us. And so, the simplicity of life here does not necessarily mean that we are materially poor, but also in today's world and age, especially with younger people, how do we promote the spirit of generosity, the spirit of poverty? And I think that is key to seeing the connection between Laudato Si and seminary formation. I found this, of course, this is PDV, something that I grew in during my generation in the seminary. It simply states, poverty alone assures the priest remains available to be sent wherever his work will be most useful and needed, even at the cost of personal sacrifice. So I think the simplicity of life here is not just about things or material things, but also to be able to look at the spirit of generosity that one is called to. The second implication that we could look at that Laudato Si calls for in seminary formation is the contemplation of God. In Laudato Si, the idea of contemplation is focused more on the ability to seeing the beauty of God in His creation. I quote, "This contemplation of creation allows us to discover in each thing a teaching which God wishes to hand to us. Since, for the believer, to contemplate creation is to hear a message, to listen to a paradoxical and silent voice." So the ability to contemplate in the context of Laudato Si is to be able to read, feel, and respond to the signs of the times. Why contemplation? Contemplation offers the searching heart an alternative understanding of the quality of life. It encourages a prophetic and a contemplative lifestyle, one that is capable to enjoy freedom from the obsession with consumption. So in this context, I see seminary formation can offer a renewed understanding of spirituality. Not just an emphasis on prayer or methods of prayer, but a spirituality that leads to forming future priests who are capable of being completely present to everyone and to everything. And that is from Laudato Si. The contemplation of God comes from our corporeality. That is indeed connected profoundly to the incarnation of Jesus. This means all the creatures of the material universe find their true meaning in the incarnate Word. For the Son of God has incorporated in his person part of the material world, planting in it a seed of definitive transformation. One way, or one thing that could quite easily be introduced or experienced in seminary formation would be the celebration of the sacraments. And Laudato Si talks about that. The sacraments are a privileged way in which nature is taken up by God to become a means of mediating supernatural life. Through our worship of God, we are invited to embrace the world in a different plane. So examples would be like paraliturgies, reflections, meditations that highlight the creative nature of God and the presence of God in nature can be a pathway forward. Third, the concern for the poor. Some of you will remember that in the late 60s through the 70s, the theme of the poor dominated much of our theological discussion. In fact, when I was in the seminary, the option for the poor was a course by itself. You know, it was a very important course, part of moral theology. So today we're talking about poor in a new sense. However, today the description of the poor can be widened to include many other aspects of poverty. Okay, in Asia, poverty shows itself in many ways: hunger, discrimination, violence against women, abuse of children, the destruction of the unborn life, natural disasters, including climate change. Okay, and so Laudato Si speaks about the economically poor, the marginalized, and the unjust situations caused by capitalism. I just did a word search. In Laudato Si, the word poor appears 44 times, you know, and perhaps it is the single group that is being mentioned and cared for the most number of times in Laudato Si. Okay? And so, the Ratio also talks about it. Future priests should have a special place in their hearts for the poorest and the weakest. This simply means that seminary formation should find ways to help seminarians to be permeated by a pastoral spirit, because this will make them able to demonstrate the same compassion, generosity, love for all, especially the poor. When we talk about those who are affected by climate change, the poor and the vulnerable are the primary groups that are affected by these changes. And so, perhaps in the seminary now formation, how do we help our young seminarians to grow in their concern for the poor, which has special attention in Laudato Si? The fourth, the protection of the environment. As I mentioned to you earlier, in the Ratio, it states the protection of the environment and caring for our common home belongs to the Christian outlook of man and reality. Okay? It belongs to all of us. So there is an anthropological vision here with regard to the care for the common home. That part of who we are becoming in terms of priestly formation, to be living signs and to live out our vocation to be protectors of God's work. So integral to seminary formation as presented in Laudato Si, and part of our vocation is not just looking after our churches, but it is also the vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork. Therefore, future priests must be highly sensitive to this particular area. The interplay between stewardship and creation needs to be widened. so as to provide a more broader inclusiveness for the purpose of an integral ecology. Okay? So I think the whole concept of stewardship needs an expansion. When we're talking about stewardship, it is not just, caring for it, but there is an interplay of many other aspects of who we are and what Laudato Si calls us for. With the God, with the self, with the other, and also with the environment that we live in. And what I would like to end in this particular area, that it has to be an integral part of the church's mission. This vocation to care for the common home, as Laudato Si presents, it speaks of this as also an integral part of the church's mission. It's not something that is outside of the church, but it's something within. Okay. The fifth implication is this. In the light of Veritatis Gaudium, intercultural or interfaith dialogue can be a key feature in the Asian reality. And so, the dialogue in this context offers us an opportunity to encounter with others. Okay? So the majority of people living in our planet profess to be believers, and therefore we can work towards protecting nature, defending the poor, and building networks of respect and fraternity. And so, looking at seminary formation, to see how seminaries can be a pathway or opening a pathway for dialogue, the capacity to enter into relationships. This is what the Ratio calls us. So that it helps future priests to be men of communion, of mission, and of dialogue. Dialogue among the various sciences, as I said earlier, interdisciplinary, is likewise needed, since each can tend to become enclosed in its own language, while specialization leads to creating isolation and the absolutization of its own field and knowledge. So it simply means that I think what Laudato Si is asking is the kind of an openness of whatever we are doing in terms of theology. It has to be interdisciplinary. It doesn't exist for itself per se, but to be able to dialogue with other aspects of the common home that we are talking about. And so, in short, I think Laudato Si calls for a priest to be a man of communion in his relations with all peoples, and a man of mission, and a man of dialogue. And so the question is, how do we incorporate these 5 implications or aspects of Laudato Si into our seminary formation? I don't have a model that I can offer all of you, but I think it's something that we start thinking about and see how we can bring about the effects of Laudato Si into our seminary formation. Starting with a simplicity of life. Today we realize that many of our, not just them, but me included, we're all impacted by this consumeristic world. How do we imbue our young men who are training with a spirit of simplicity in their lives? A lot of our seminaries are well equipped with latest technology, lives that are a lot better than outside the lives of the people. How do we imbue them with this life of simplicity? How do we bring them to a spirit of contemplation? A greater awareness of God's presence in the world today. How do we bring that into their lives? How do we help them to have greater concern for the poor? A lot of our countries, I speak of my own country, a country that's becoming so affluent, so developed, economically independent. The challenge is, how do we in the seminary help our young men to have a concern for the poor. The protection of the environment as a just cause, as an integral part of our vocation. And finally, dialogue. I would like to end with this. At the launch of a report by the Asian Development Bank and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, the director said this: Asian countries hold Earth's future in their hands. So the future of the Earth is here in Asia. We hold it in our hands. If we choose to protect ourselves against dangerous climate change, we can help save the entire planet. So it's here. It's not somewhere else. It's not in Paris. It's not in Spain. It's not in Chile. Here it's in Asia. Because it's here that we hold the future of Mother Earth. And I think as part of training our young priests, this has to be an integral part of their lived lives. As I mentioned earlier, something that they can experience, something that they can do immediately. And I think that is the challenge for us, for all of us who are here, including myself. What changes can we implement as soon as we return home, without even having to wait for the next seminary staff meeting, bishop staff meeting, policy changes, but just in our own context, in our own ways, how can we implement some of these changes, some of these implications that Laudato Si is inviting us to take, especially in the light of the crisis or the emergency that we are living in. And so if seminary formation is geared towards a journey of transformation that renews the heart and mind of a person so as to be able to discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect, as the Ratio would say, then there is always a need for an ongoing personal conversion. And using the words of Pope Francis, it includes an ecological conversion. Why, at the very beginning of Laudato Si, we hear this: Mother Earth now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her. And so I think it is time to act, and the time is now for each one of us in our own small ways. And for us who are involved in seminary formation, there are many ways. The 5 ways that I offered you are things that we could draw, at least I've been able to draw from Laudato Si as the way forward in terms of implementing some aspects of the care for the common home in concrete ways in terms of forming our young people. Thank you very much.
We have listened to very attentively. I need not summarize, but a few points, highlights, like taking off from self-introspection to what he's going to present in his own life, what it means, and then quoting the documents of the church. Care of our common home is no longer optional. And thus he based himself on Laudato Si, then Ratio Fundamentalis Institutionis Sacerdotalis 2016, and then the curriculum of studies in the Catholic universities and seminaries also come under that. That is the Veritatis Gaudium, the document issued in 2017. So these 3 key documents, and he had really taken us into the church's teachings very well, especially the 3, because we are concerned of the seminary formation. I see here many formators, so very happy that it's very apt for us. Then he has presented 5 implications, and elaborated also, and calling for each one of us. And he did not stay in the air all the time. Landed on the Asian soil, and the future of this planet is in the hands of the Asian countries in very special way, and it's time to act, and it's now. So thus he ended, and very fluent in his thought, very fluent also in his language and presentation, convinced of what he's speaking, and totally based on church's teaching for us. So thus we are very happy to have Father Clarence Devdas this morning. Now it's time for us to make observations or interventions or add or seek clarifications or even question what he has told us. We have nearly half hour. So over to the floor. Kindly lift your hands and also introduce yourself when you make your observations or comments, and let us know from where you are. Thank you. Over to the floor now. Yes, Father. This third row here.
Thank you very much, Father, for the beautiful presentation based on the important documents. And
Kindly your name and
I am Father Joseph Das Jabaratnam, the Vicar General and the formator in the Jaffna Diocese, Sri Lanka, the major seminary. The 5 things that you highlighted, I think the last one is the very important thing, the dialogue. The dialogue, there should be 3 types, the ecumenical dialogue, interreligious dialogue, and dialogue with creation. Because sometimes we are worried about the dialogue with creation now, but sometimes we fail in the other 2. Especially we Asians, we are living in a multi-religious and multicultural environment. Especially the seminarians, they should be able to accept the other religions first, the people of the other denominations and other religious people. Sometimes they begin to hate, especially there are so many young priests now, when they go to the parish, the first thing they do is find out where the denominations are and gather the people and go and destroy their churches and temples and all that. And also they work against the other people of the other religions. So this ecumenical formation dialogue and interreligious dialogue, unless we begin there, it is impossible to have a dialogue with creation. I would like to quote once again Jesus when he asked Peter, do you love me? Then he said, look after my sheep. He didn't say look after your sheep. Sometimes we think we are looking after our sheep. We are not worried about Jesus' sheep. His sheep is not only the Catholics. His sheep is even the other denominations, the people of other denominations, the people of other religions. The whole human beings are his sheep, and also the creatures, the whole thing. His sheep includes all the human beings and all the creatures, the creation. So if we can understand what Jesus said, look after my sheep, then only we will be able to love our neighbor, love the creation, and we will be able to have a very fruitful ecumenical dialogue and interreligious dialogue and dialogue with creation. So the seminaries, this formation is very, very essential. So we cannot directly start with dialogue with creation unless we begin a dialogue with the other human beings. Thank you.
yes, yeah, Bishop. Yeah. So after observations, you answer.
I'm Bishop Joseph Hung from Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. I appreciate very much your development of concept of stewardship um, with the 5 implication in seminary formation. And I think very much the concept of stewardship because the priest is considered of stewards of sacred mysteries. And now with the focus on the stewards of the creation, it's very, very good ideas. And with the 5 implication, first against the consumerism, and at the same time, in the Pope Francis focused on the culture of throwaway. It's very interesting. And the second one, the contemplation of God, what is very good, and generosity, not selfishness. And the third one, concern of the poor, that is the who cannot benefit on the good things, because on good things the profits by the rich and the poor as nothing. And fourth, the protection and the environment, and the conclusion with dialogues. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you.
Father John.
I'm Father Luke Rodriguez, Bombay. Thank you, Father Clarence, for this presentation, because it takes forward a lot our thinking and our efforts to implement. Because you've given these 5 areas, drawing from the documents, but nicely put there. It helps us to understand better what the areas to work in, besides say taking a course, into integrating into life. If you can just, say a little more on. I know you said it would come from the floor, but certain key hints on maybe the second one, on grateful contemplation of God's world. So how could that be? Just a couple of examples of how that could be done in this seminary. That would be helpful. Thank you.
So, thank you, Father Devdas. You would like to respond?
Thank you very much for your observations, and it also enriches me in that process of my own reflection. I totally agree with you. Ecumenical and interreligious dialogue is key. I teach Vatican II in the seminary as part of the program for the initial years, and the exposure to these realities are very limited. Sometimes recently I asked the group of seminarians. We have the Catholic seminary here, and maybe this is Malaysia. About 3 kilometers down the road is the Baptist seminary. He said, have you seminarians gone and visited them and had tea with them at least? Oh no, we haven't gone them. That's not part of the program. So I think that awareness of the need for ecumenical and interreligious dialogue it's very crucial, especially here in Asia and the context that we live in. Thank you very much, Bishop, for your comments also. Father Luke, contemplation of God's world. And I think one of these things is, I begin to see a phenomenon happening much in Southeast Asia. I don't know, at least in the regions that I live in, is that the whole idea of a separation between the sacred and the secular, this kind of duality in our Catholic spirituality seems to be catching on, especially with younger people, and a failure to see God in the secular. I mean, I'm using those terms. I hope you understand what I mean, in the sense that the whole idea of that incarnation is taken away, that God belongs in a separate space somewhere else. So very often, my experience with some younger people is that they speak of God has a separate language, God has a separate place, and they don't see God incarnated into the realities of human life. And I think that is the challenge. The contemplation of God's world is not just a spiritual deepening, but a spiritual deepening that is grounded in the world and in the context that we live in. And I believe that is something that probably we could do. I remember, which I don't see in my own seminary today. When I was my first year, we used to have this immersion programs, which means that I went and lived in the slums for 1 week, and to see God in that context and come back and reflect, but which my seminary has abandoned completely. I don't know in the other seminaries whether they are still there. We are sent away and to go. So I think that has also caused a bit of this dichotomy, this duality between sacred and secular. So I think one way is to be able to reconnect. For me, I always say that to reconnect with the core of our spirituality is the incarnation, and the incarnation is in the corporality of Jesus coming into the world, and to be able to see Christ in everything. That's one of the things that I could think of immediately to respond to say how to do it. Do you have immersion programs in your seminary? Are they sent away? Yeah. Yeah. It's something that I think also, I often challenge my students is that I say as you grow on in years in the seminary, your world becomes smaller. From an expanded world, it kind of narrows down from the world that you live in, your families and all that. Slowly it becomes your seminary, then your own classmates, then it becomes the Presbyterium, then you look at your own parish. It's becoming smaller and smaller. I think we need to go the other way around, that to see that, kind of an expansive world, to see God in present in the different realities.
So we move to the second round.
Yeah.
Father.
I'm Father Joseph Chong from Vietnam. We are here, so all familiars, and we are concerned about the ratio with for pillars, for dimensions, human and international and spiritual and practical, pastoral. Yes, and your topic is very interesting because it's concerned about the theological principle of stewardship. Stewardship with 5 principles. And myself also concerned about how to find that the connections between 5 elements, 5 principles, with 4 pillars, 4 dimensions. And because sometimes we worry about, sometimes we have lots of standards. For example, 5 elements, you show it, and 4 elements, 4 pillars, how to collect it, how to integrate, how to adapt 5 principles to 4 pillars, and easy for us to follow up strictly ratio. Thank you.
Thank you. Bishop Milo.
Father Clarence, thank you for sort of pinpointing in 5 points, this perspective. What I'd like a comment from you is the formation of millennial seminarians. When you were sharing, you were talking of how you were formed decades ago, as I was. So I find this interesting for the benefit of the bishops and seminary formators here, because we're in an age where we have millennials, post-millennials, and we're going to the alpha age and so on and so forth. And it's good to see in terms of capacity to reflect and to see things through with regards to ecological conversion and education. In your experience, as you are still immersed into teaching in the seminary, and you are before millennial seminarians, what perhaps I'd like to ask from you, which may be also an experience in different Asian countries and cultures, is in terms of environmental education, in terms of consciousness, what is the experience of trying to enter this formative process with regards to millennial seminarians becoming millennial priests?
Anybody else?
Okay, Father Joseph from Mumbai.
Thank you very much, Father Clarence, for the very clear presentation and the 5 points that you have highlighted. I think some of the thing that I'm wondering whether what you have said and what the document suggests still, there seem to be some sort of a lacune. Because I feel we still need a radical structural changes in the seminary. These 5 seem to be very idealistic, but to implement them and put them into action or translate them into action with our, as Bishop pointed out, millennial seminarians is a task. It's not so easy. One of the reasons I feel is our seminarians are well sheltered and well protected in the seminary. They are, at times, they are not even aware as to what's happening in the world, because they don't even, some of them don't even read the newspapers. We are talking so much about, about climate change, about how climate change affects poor. But a lot of our seminarians don't seem to have that contact with the poor. And this is because our structural formation, our structures in the seminary are something that do not really promote seminarians to go out. Like, for example, in our seminary, when I was in my 3rd year theology, I spent the whole year living in the slums. We call it the live-in experience. But for some reason, it has been discontinued. We have this short program like 1 month, etc. It gives a gist about what happens, but it doesn't really help our seminarians to come directly in contact with reality. So I feel we need some sort of structural reforms rather than, talking about these things which are very important. But they don't get translated because the structures are something that block us. So I was very disappointed also with Veritatis Gaudium, because it speaks about a lot of things, but the basic core is the same, the traditional approach and the 4 areas of formation. So I personally feel that all these 5 very important areas with our seminarians, I think we need some sort of a structural reform. So one is maybe 1 full year they are living in the slums, or what we were suggesting and discussing in the Mumbai Seminary is how maybe 2nd year and 3rd years they live in the parishes and they travel to the seminary just to attend classes. They complete the classes and they go and stay in the parishes. So basically it's like a 2-way process, that they are in contact with the people. At the same time, there is intellectual and spiritual formation that takes place in the seminary. We have been toying on this idea, but there's no breakthrough as such. Thank you.
So for Clarence.
First to the comment of Father Joseph, how to integrate the 4 aspects of formation, and also the 5 points that I've presented. I think to find new pathways is always a challenge. To find a new pathway. What I have seen and what I have in my own reflection with Laudato Si, it calls for simple changes with regard to all aspects of the seminarian's life. I don't want to break down formation, and I've always resisted when we talk about human, intellectual, spiritual, and pastoral. It's like 4 components of a one big entity, but formation, which is already talks about, when you talk of formation, it includes all 4 aspects of the seminary or the seminarian. So to be able to find an integration, I think the context is, and I think we all been talking about is also the experience, how to be able to integrate the experience of life into that 4 aspects. And what I have proposing here, the 5, comes from an experiential level, basically. Whether it's the simplicity of life, it's the care for the poor, or it's contemplation and the protection of the environment and dialogue, comes from the lived experience of a seminarian, or the context of the seminary. And I think that integration takes place in small ways. There isn't a kind of a way to say that these things integrate, or there's this cross section where they all integrate. But in small and little ways, they contribute to the larger formation of the person. I hope I've been able to give some ideas about that. Bishop Milo, you always have the tough questions. How do we train our millennials? And I think this is the challenge that I found this. I found this with our younger people. They are very passionate about social causes. Our young people, more than people of my generation. and I would be the first to admit it. They're very passionate about justice. They're very passionate about ecology. They're very passionate about other issues. But somewhat, I think we need to find a way that it's not just being fashionable. Sometimes it's also being fashionable to be ecological, ecologically friendly, or to have certain cause that you want to champion or challenge. But with our younger people, what I have found is that if you're able to reason out with them and to see that the priestly vocation is more than just celebrating mass or administering the sacraments, and that it encompasses a larger reality, then they are a bit more open to that idea. And I think it goes back to what Father was saying just now, in terms of not just your sheep but Jesus' sheep. And I found that a big challenge. As much as they have a cause for all these different issues, but the view of the church for them is quite insular. It's quite very small. And with the younger people is to be able to offer them to look at the church from a wider perspective, that the church is not just in the confines of your parish or of the walls of your parish, but to be able to offer them a new reality that they can engage with these causes, to see it as part of the spiritual journey. How to do it? Yeah, that's something that requires a lot of reflection. I don't have a clear answer to how to do it, but I think a conversation and the immersion that we keep talking about are ways to open them to the new realities, the ecological conversion that we're talking about. And I think this is where I'm struggling with, even my own, the way I teach in the seminary, that what I teach and what I teach is very textbook confined to the classroom, and it's not being experienced enough. So I've been talking to the Dean of Studies. I teach two courses. I teach two courses this year, Nostra Aetate and the one Unitatis Reintegratio. It's very classroom. I said, can you give me a bit more time so that I can take them out to meet people of different religions and different churches, so that when I come back to the classroom, I have something to talk about with the document. Dean of Studies have to always say, Father, no time for the how do we do it. So I think that's the problem, that what we teach it's confined to the classroom, and we leave it to them to expect them to go and find the solution outside. And I think that's very limiting for me when I teach. I talk about other religions, and if I don't go out to meet them and talk to them or ask them to go out, it doesn't happen naturally. So I simple question I ask them is, as you enter the seminary, how many of your friends, your inner circle of friends, are people of other religion that you have kept in touch with? And it's very few. It's very few. So I think that's where, I think with the millennials who are very tactile, who are very experiential, maybe we need to take them out to help them experience, to have that ecological conversion, to get them out into the field, away from the classroom. Maybe it needs a new model. And I think for the Joseph, structural changes, those are the most difficult things that to bring about in the seminary. Sometimes, like I said, I've been struggling with the Dean of Studies, so I'm asking, I said, next year I want this, I'm asking this, can you give me this before I teach? Because I myself have found it very, very limiting in terms of just looking at the documents and sitting in the classroom and talking about ideas when we are not out there engaging and sharing the experiences. So I think, with the millennials, maybe the generation, I look around, maybe we're all mostly the same generation. It worked, in the classroom because we came from a different, society background. And I think that's the challenge. I think the first point is that, many of us came up with, countries that were developing. And the ones that are coming now are coming from very developed, affluent backgrounds, and maybe they need that experiential part of the seminary formation.
So we have just for one, at the most two, last interventions. Alvin, for Alvin, please be brief.
Very brief indeed. Since 2015 until now, and I can see that there's one encyclical on the light of faith, the other is on the gospel of the joy of the gospel, one is for the care of the common home, and the other two is for the holiness in today's world. I was once a seminarian. Are you in the seminary before? And I know that the burden of all the learnings, and all professors just said that this subject is very, very important, okay? So you have to take time to study on this thing. Now, since 2015 until now, how many years? 4 years, right? And we have 5, 1 encyclical and 4 exhortation. They are all very important. The faith, the gospel, 2 for the teaching of the holiness of the life, and 1 is the joy of the gospel. Is that too much for the seminarian to study? And what are actually the implications on this teaching? What is actually the urgent call for seminary formation now? Thank you.
Alvin. Bishop Alvin.
Yeah, Bishop Alvin de Silva, and something which Father Joe spoke. I began to think about it. I think the seminary is not the only place where we form, because the parish priests play a very important part, because seminarians are looking at the parish priests. So staying with the parishes also will be a good idea. And they are looking at the diocese, how the diocese is functioning, whether it is following the ecological conversion. Because one clear example is Pope Francis. He has changed the whole thinking of the church. So it is not only the formators and the seminarians or the seminary, but also the outside forces that need to be converted also, ecological conversion and all the other things.
So, thank you very much, Clarence.
Just going back to this part I kind of did not mention. In the ratio, it talks about the importance of seminary formators and professors who play the role of teacher. They're not just teaching a subject, but they are to act as role models and guides. And I think it's very much what Bishop Alvin is saying. It talks about personal and community accompaniment in the formation. So I think not just seminary, but I think the community also plays an important part of the forming of young seminarians, priests, professors, formators. They all play an integral part of that formation. Just to conclude, sorry, Father. I think the documents of Pope Francis. That's always the fight with the Dean of Studies. So something that the fight continues. I believe that what I'm offering is just a little launch pad for deeper discussion and reflection. It's not the solution to all our problems, but at least some points for us to think, and some things that we can impact almost immediately. That's what I was trying to think when I was doing this. Something that each one of us can take back and implement almost immediately in the things that we are doing. Without having to change structures, without having to seek permission, but in small ways to inculcate the spirit of simplicity, of prayer, of justice, concern for the poor, the vocation as the promotion of the protection of the environment as a vocation, and the aspects of dialogue. And these are 5 things that each one of us, when we teach or when we communicate with our students, we can already do it in an informal way. And so that, as I said, that had been in my mind. Because I think sometimes one of the things that, I mean, it's not I guess the system is such, we go from seminars to seminar to conference, and then we go back to a situation that nothing changes, you know. The aircon is still on, you know, and you know, everything else. But I think maybe if we can do little things, then we make it happen better. So I think I hope this has been some help for a deeper stimulation of thought, and also implications for our own lives. Also, I think when I wrote this, I was the first recipient, so I wrote it for myself. You know, to check myself, and I share with you what I reflected with regard to Laudato Si and my life as both seminarian and a priest today. So thank you very much for this opportunity and this conversation.
Thank you. So I thank all those who intervened. I saw that we are really grounding ourselves at the grassroots level, not only in Asia, which is a big continent, and in each of our countries, in our context. So thanks to this August House. Now we would like to honor our speaker, the resource person here,